Thank you very much for joining us on this first Melbourne Press Club event of 2018. I'd now like to formally introduce our panel. Starting to my immediate right, James Jeffrey is the editor of, I think, the delightfully named column Struth in The Australian. He is also, I think, one of this country's finest parliamentary sketch writers. He spends a lot of time zipping between Sydney and Canberra, and I always look forward to reading James Jeffrey's unique take on federal politics and also the tidbits he gets in his Struth column. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, My Family and Other Animus, which I think I'm going to buy just on title alone. Please make James Jeffrey welcome. Sitting next to him is, I think, in my humble opinion, News Corp's best gossip columnist in Melbourne. Alice Costa has spent many, many years plying her trade. She was on the weekday confidential pages for so long, earning her stripes, stalking coked-up footballers at Brownlow nights and pissed B-grade celebrities at the Logies. I've seen you do it. I'm not one. And she is now the editor of page 13 in the Saturday Herald Sun, the first thing I read on a Saturday morning, because she has this city well and truly covered in sport, politics, entertainment and everything else. Please make Alice very welcome too. Joe Aston exceeded himself this morning in Rear Window. If you haven't caught up with it yet, in the space of one item, he managed to call the federal Liberal MP a prize idiot and a tech guru a deluded tosspot. And it goes to Joe's very particular way of cutting through to various issues and deflating sometimes extremely pompous egos in the world of politics and business. He has been the editor of the Rear Window column for 5 or 6 years now as well. It is the first thing, sorry James, that I pick up on a weekday morning, and I think a lot of people, having spoken to a few of you here, it's the first thing you go to. No hard feelings. I get to Struth second. I look at Rear Window because Joe's always got something very interesting. He also is the author of Adventures with Joe Aston in the Weekend Fin Review, and I'm pretty sure doing that job exhausts all of Fairfax travel budget, although Joe insists there's a bit of personal contributions as well. Just keeping tracks of Joe's tour around the world, staying at the best hotels and flying at the front of the plane. I'd be very jealous. I live through you vicariously, Joe. Please make Joe Aston very welcome too. What is your approach to your various columns? What's your mission statement? How do you set out to do your job every day?
I'm still not entirely sure. I've been doing it for must be edging towards 10 years. So I think around about the decade mark I should have it figured out. But it's, I basically start with whatever amuses me and work my way forward from there.
It's a pretty good approach to take. Alice?
I like to, the column's very Melbourne, so I kind of try and think what do Melburnians like, which is basically football and coked up footballers. And just, you know, I kind of use that as a kind of ground point, and then, you know, I think you can't take anything too seriously. You know, it's a fun column, so you try and have a bit of a, you know, a bit of a laugh and things that amuse me as well. That's usually what gets in.
And Joe?
It's funny how hard I think it is to, I think we're proving it is quite hard to explain what you're looking for, what it looks like to you, because you don't kind of, you know, like in the Supreme Court case, you know, with obscenity, you don't quite know what it is, but you know when you see it. But I guess for me the mission is to identify hubris, cant, farce, hypocrisy, etc. And there's just boundless volumes of it. I almost feel increasingly so. And the key is to is actually how to choose which rabbit holes to go down, because inevitably you make decisions every day to let people off the hook because there's just not enough space and there's not enough time. So without even knowing it, there are a lot of people out there who have been very fortunate
in this room.
I've seen a few.
Watch this space. So you, in a speech a few years ago to the Sydney Institute, Joe, you said the secret of good gossip writing is absolute, unadulterated rather, terrifying fearlessness. And you do need a fair bit of that because you are piercing heavily protected corporate reputations and political reputations too.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that is most important, and it's something that you can feign and teach yourself. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say I used to. I mean, in my first year or two of doing this job, I'd had the night terrors. You know, you'd read everything. You'd wait for what was going to be said about you, and you're waiting for the emails from the lawyers, and had you got a fact wrong, and had you picked with the wrong, fucked with the wrong Marine, as they say in a few Good Men. But in a few, you do actually come to realise that it doesn't actually matter very much if someone doesn't like you. And the more times that you walk into a large room of people and 3/4 of the people are staring at you like they want to kill you, it gets easier. I mean, you can get used to anything in life.
And it's hard for you, Alice, as well, being particularly Melbourne-centric for good reason. It is in many respects a small town when you look at the AFL milieu and the like, and you have trod on some very powerful toes as well. So do you ever have those night sweats, those moments of sheer terror?
I've still got the night terrors. I'd like to know when they stop. But, waking up on Saturday morning, you kind of brace yourself. I call it sort of putting your armour on. And, going up against, I've had some pretty robust conversations with some footy managers over the past couple of years, and, you brace yourself. But, it goes with the territory. As my dad, who's a journo, he always told me if you sting someone, you've got to be expected to be stung back. So you've got to make those hard calls, but you've got to take them as well the following day. And, my kid's been in the back of the car once when one manager, Paul Connors, I think his name was, told me he wanted to knock my effing block off, and,
on speakerphone.
Oh, yeah, on speakerphone. I wish I'd tape it. And then, it would have made column inches the next week, but, that's how it goes.
Couldn't you just record that stuff and have it as a ringtone?
Well, actually, we were discussing this earlier. You got a particularly juicy voicemail from Sam Newman.
I did.
Recently.
Yeah, that wasn't actually to me, but it was to a contact who then gave it to me, and we, why not? We called it the Cunt Files. That's what he was saying. I was quoting him. So, yeah, Sam Newman gets a bit shitty when I call him now.
Yeah, and James, pollies have fairly robust egos, don't they? You don't get any blowback from the stuff you write?
The weird thing about pollies is they're kind of masochistic. It doesn't matter generally how you take the piss out of them. They seem to... They're sort of like Labradors, and whatever you do to them, they wag their tails. So it's a bit different for me. I'm fairly... probably too sanguine about Australian politics. I lived and worked in Moscow for a while, and after that, everything feels like Smurf Village for quite a few years. I see them fuck up, and at the same time, no one's getting dragged off to a labour camp. So it's, but maybe one day. But I try to. I've been shouted at once or twice, mainly Queensland politicians for some reason. A couple have put me in the deep freeze. If you want to stay on speaking terms with Erica Betts, don't write about his sphincter and the health thereof. That's what I've learned. But look, you can do all sorts of stuff, and they lap it up. I'm just going to read just a tiny paragraph, just to give you an idea if I can actually unlock the bloody thing. What I try to do, basically, is tread that fine line between just taking the piss a bit, having a bit of a prod, but trying not to be an arsehole. I think
you walk a fine line on that some days. I'm not saying you're an arsehole.
Look, you can do all sorts of things though. This is the one bit I'll read. All right. This is just a Struth item now. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union in World War II, a curious thing happened. As it began to cross the grassy sea of the steppe, some of its soldiers began to get disorientated. With neither mountains nor hills to guide them, they marched for days, feeling like they hadn't moved. You can do this on a small scale and without the human calamity by driving across the Hay Plain. But we digress. Anyway, this brings us to the question time voice of Paul Fletcher. To hear the Territory's Minister address Parliament is to step onto an endless plane of words. There is nothing to lock onto, none of the usual topography of pitch and tone, just a taste of eternity. When he stops talking, the regular world falls back on you with a thud. Incidentally, Fletcher answered 2 questions yesterday. 4 people remained in the public gallery after question time, either keen or paralysed.
And what did he say to that, if anything?
Word came through to him that he loved it. And so, what can you do? Start beating them off with a stick or something. So,
Joe, do you want to buy in?
Oh, I was going to say just kind of agreeing very much with James, because I write a bit about politics and across business, and politicians actually deserve a huge rap for actually how much shit they do take. I mean, if you think about some of the things that are said about politicians in their course of work, it can be pretty hairy and pretty. I speak with a great deal of experience, saying similar things or even things that are far tamer about the chairman and CEOs of very large companies, the very rich, the idle rich, and they have the thinnest skins. So politicians actually, in some ways, are far better sports. There's always exceptions. And the only other thing I was going to say with James is that I try absolutely to veer into arsehole. I actually try and stay on that side of the fine line all the time.
and between us, you find that there's balance in the force.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. They'll be delighted to take a question, and we'll get a microphone around. We have Glynis, I think, at the back there. Yes, thanks, Joe.
Mike Osborne, AAP. I just wonder how you guys deal with the delicate situation of taking the piss out of your own executives. News Corp's pretty good at taking the piss out of Fairfax people and vice versa, but when it's your own people in the line of fire, how do you deal with that and get that through your editors?
I love them all.
Me too.
When I started doing Rear Window, it's now on the back page, but it was inside the book, and it was probably slightly less abusive and obscene than it had been. But I found to get a very big response, mainly because the media loves talking about itself so much, was to write a lot about what was going on behind the scenes at Holt Street, at Willoughby. I'm talking in Sydney expressions now, but you know what I mean. So it's good fodder. I would say, and I'm more than happy to be called up on it if it's believed that I'm talking my own book or looking through rose-coloured glasses. But I think Fairfax has been really, really great about true freedom to write whatever you want, including about my colleagues at the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and including about some executives. But, and I think that's kind of... it's a different situation when you've got a charter of independence, mainly institutional shareholders, as opposed to being at News or being at Seven, where you've got a large proprietor with a long history and large families and allies in major cities and this kind of thing, where it becomes quite complex. Writing, if you're at News Corp trying to write about Channel 10 when Lachlan was one of its largest shareholders, for example. But I mean, I remember telling Gail Hamley, our general counsel, that I knew that I'd got word that they were going to cut another 80 jobs, and out of editorial, and that I was going to write it. And they weren't very happy about it, especially when I wrote 80 and they cut 100. But I remember it being perceived in the Murdoch press like it was fed to me as a drop or something like that. So you kind of can't win if you write about your own employer. There's some people who are going to think that you're talking their book for them. But it's more... I mean, I haven't found it to be... Well, when Roger Corbett retired as our chairman, I had an absolute field day because he wasn't our chairman anymore. Now, would I have actually out and out called him a fool when he was still our chairman? Probably not. But, you know, the gloves were off as soon as he walked out the door. And I'm sure that's the way James feels, and Alice feel as well.
Well, it's
Roger,
true that
about Roger Corbett.
I may have called for one colleague to be sued, but only once he was safely off the full-time payroll. But that's the only lawsuit I've called for, so I've been very restrained on that front, so bravo me. But on another front, so when the Sydney University newspaper, On His Soir, did a piss take of the Oz, but it was pretty good. But their front page splash was about, you know, Rupert Murdoch dead at 802 or whatever it was, and I thought the best approach was, well, let's cover it. So we had a gratuitous photo of me carefully reading it, looking very thoughtful, and gave them a few tips on how to make it better next time. You just roll with it.
And Alice, we'll get to a question there in a moment. The Herald Sun is, you know, closely connected with the AFL and all things Melbourne. Have you found any pressure from up high, good or bad?
Oh, look, I think a lot of people in the public seem to think that you're kind of silenced, or maybe there's a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, not to write things. But I kind of don't listen to the winks or the nudges and kind of just go forth and write. Like, usually every week I try and kind of push the boundary a bit and see if it will make it through the paper. And I mean, at the beginning, the subs used to be like, you can't put this in, this is just not acceptable. And I just trot over to the editor and he'd go, yeah, put it in. So I feel like there's now a bit of leeway. The subs now kind of go, oh, it's page 13, you know, it can go through. And, you know, I think people kind of have this perception that there is a lot of kind of, you can write this or pushing agendas, but it really is kind of like what you guys were saying before. It's what tickles you that week and what makes you excited, and put it in as hard and go as hard as you can.
We just have a question here, Bill.
Okay.
Yes.
Joe, I understand that Rear Window is probably one of the most leaked to columns in the media in Australia. How do you decide which of the leaks you will investigate, which are the ones you will follow down the rabbit burrow, which ones you'll just throw in the bin?
Well, I mean, it depends on how much headspace you have. You know, you can bite off a really big story and pursue it for months and months and stay on it. And I think it's important to do that, to own something and to pursue it to its ungainly end. But you can only really be doing one of those at a time, maybe two, because it requires hours and hours and hours of reading documents and downloading documents and having phone conversations, etc. So you do you might start early in the morning and get 4 or 5 hours into research and go, I actually have to put this aside now, because if I don't stop and just punch out some copy, then I'm not going to get the column done. And so there's a bit of a balance with that, because there are some stories that come very easily where, you know, you can get really angry about you know, some peanut Liberal Party backbencher from Queensland, and it comes, you know, after a couple of bottles of wine, you can just kind of riff, but you know, if you're looking into maladministration or you know, the kind of heavier, more serious stuff, it takes a lot of concentration, it takes a lot of research, and if you fuck it up, they'll kill you. So it's just a balancing act. But just one thing I was going to say, a really good example of how, Alice was saying, you know, everyone just makes these really juvenile assumptions about the media, about particular media organisations. And I was only thinking about this yesterday, that this Cormac Foundation thing that's going on here in Victoria between the Liberal Party corporate elders and the Liberal Party itself, particularly Michael Kroger, its president, is a great example of how, people at News might think that, we're monotheistic and slavish in devotion to our executive management. I mean, if you think about who's involved there, you've got Rupert's brother-in-law, John Calvert-Jones, who's quit both boards and is absolutely furious about it, goes to London. Rupert speaks to Rupert. All of a sudden, Terry McCrann in the Herald Sun is going absolutely after Michael Kroger. But Michael Kroger's a paid spokesman on Sky News, which is now 100% owned by News. John Ferguson in the Australian is, ostensibly, I think, writes generally fairly favourably on Michael Kroger. And so if you lay out all the pieces, there's no order from on high that you have to take one side. There's one big quite homogenous set of personalities, including the parties to the story. But I just thought that was a good example.
Well, I think we're basically the broad church that the Liberal Party should aspire to be.
Yes, a question over there. Well, as the mic gets to you, just a snap poll, you mentioned defamation, James. How many times have each of you been sued? Starting with you, James.
They're unhappy memories. Thank you for bringing it up. It's been, look, not a lot, to be honest, considering. But it's been a couple of times, and the first time it was so new to me. You're talking about night sweats and the rest of it, and waking up. And I dispensed with the waking up in horror by not sleeping for several days. And now that I think about it, I probably won't sleep again tonight. I don't know, it's all gone. I actually met the person years later, and it was a lot of fun. But at the time, no.
Alice?
Yeah, a few come to mind. Jeffrey Edelston, John Stephenson. I think I wrote a story about him. Don't you know who I am? And it proved that people didn't know who he was.
By the way,
got
do you mind
that legal letter on my.
Do you mind telling us who that is?
Well, he was allegedly at the races, and he was a bouncer. Was saying, "Oh, you can't." He said, "Don't you know who I am?" And he was making up all this. Carrying on, and a legal letter followed suit, but we proved it to be true. We write the truth.
Yes.
And, Jeffrey Edelston's always loved a legal letter, but I won't go into them because
he's yet to succeed on that front as well, isn't he,
well,
Jeffrey?
Yeah. We'll move on from there.
Give him time. Joe? You'd be sued daily, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I've only successfully been sued twice, and I'm quite proud of that. The first time was Kim Williams over a story that whose ultimate premise was right, but I had sources go to water, and we couldn't put them on the stand, and there were a couple of facts in the story that were wrong. And that was a pretty high profile embarrassment for me in the first one, and it was also painful for me and for the company, because it was the first time I'd written a story which was for the Fin Review that the Sydney Morning Herald decided to take as their front page splash.
Right.
So we settled. I think it's public. We paid him $95,000 or something like that. But obviously we went to court initially, so the legal costs were much higher than that, and we had to pay his as well. And then the only other time that we've folded was with a stockbroker called Michael Kadari, who's most people have never heard of as well. But it was right when we were fighting Alex Malley, and we made the decision Fairfax said to me, "Look, this is a pain in the arse. We're probably going to lose." This is right when Rebel Wilson as well is happening, and that's really changed the game, at least until hopefully it's overturned on appeal. But so we've had to be more careful. So yeah, look, we made a resources decision that the lawyers said to me, "Look, pay him, say sorry, pay him some money, then we can focus on Mally, and on that basis, if we have to go all the way to court, then we'll do that. And so, you have to kind of sometimes make those hard decisions and focus on the things that actually, that matter.
We've got a question over here, yes.
Yeah, Simon Feely. My question's for Joe Aston. You've just introduced the topic I was going to ask about. I was going to ask you facetiously if you've been offered a directorship at the CPA. Since all the good work you did on that score, and no doubt there were sleepless nights, but you must have had a few hate calls and others, but I want to congratulate you on the work you did on that. It was a fascinating read for a long, long time.
Thank you. No, I have not been offered a directorship of CPA.
So if you're listening, CBA.
It was a interesting story, and I was just saying to Michael at the table, I'd like to think that it's not over, because the board the board that's gone chose the board that's replaced it, and in return that new board has failed to do any serious investigating into some of the financial irregularities and improprieties that I definitely am confident happened and are discoverable. But so I hope it's not over. But yes, it did go on for a long time. And if there's one thing you can say about Alex Mally is that he's got long fingernails. He clung on for a long time.
Raise your hand if you have a question. I just wanted to ask each of you, is there somebody in particular in the corporate, entertainment or sporting worlds that you most enjoy tweaking, attacking or having fun with just for the sheer and utter sport? James, starting with you. Maybe a politician? And you've mentioned Eric Abetz already, so he's disqualified.
Can't I mention him again? I mean, it's always delightful to go back to him. I always find that, I know it's a large fish in a small barrel, but there's something I just find irresistible about Bob Catter. You do really feel like you have left the three known dimensions and gone over into something else. And when I started doing the 404 entries for the Australian Zero page, I left Bob Catter's one until I was about a bottle and a half of Shiraz into the evening, and then that's when I thought, right, think like Bob. And I think I nailed it, but I felt like I saw something within me that frightened me. And I knew that there was a Bob there. So it's just a mad whirlwind with him, and it's just a different experience. So one of these days his head gasket is actually going to explode. It's just going to be a puff of fine red mist out of both ears. But in the meantime, it's something I just want to keep prodding and touching and going back to. I can't resist.
Alice?
I know what you mean about that prodding. There's something irresistible about it. I think there are a lot of prickly little snowflakes in Melbourne and the sporting world, and I think when you do give them a bit of a whack and they really respond. James Brayshaw, just saying his name, I mean he just can't help but get prickly, and so you just can't help but give them a whack, and so it kind of goes back and forth. Who's another one? Oh, Ricky Nixon, that's always fun, the former disgraced footy manager. He hates me writing that, and every time I write that before his name. And that was more after waking up on an Easter Sunday with my little toddler in tow and looking at social media, which is always a bad thing to do. And he told all his followers to go out and buy me a can of Powell because I was Rupert Murdoch's lapdog. So I thought, you know what, I've got the column inches, I can put him in there, so I do, often.
Lapdog's pretty fancy though, they don't normally get Powell. Well, she hasn't really researched this.
I will. At least it's better than a sunky Labrador.
Joe?
I just think it's very hard to go past Eddie Maguire.
You can't go past Eddie Maguire, he is omnipresent.
Yeah, well, exactly. So, I mean, I've had a lot of fun with him. And, of course, we've got a Collingwood director up the back, I see. Anyway, he would be my favourite. he takes the bait every time.
In a bad way? As in, what, you say he's got a bit of a thin skin?
Oh, absolutely. I still remember when he said, he shirt fronted me at the races a couple of years ago, which in fact this other Collingwood director in the room was there too, would have witnessed it. And it was probably an unwise decision for Eddie because, as Alice just said, you know, I'm the one with the column inches, though, mind you, he certainly is not short of a microphone. The beauty is, and the beauty of having that kind of inside baseball readership of the Fin Review is that all of my readers know who he is, but he's famous, but none of his listeners know who I am or care. So he could sound off about me on Southern Cross, and the EP would be in there in 5 seconds saying, "Can you talk about something that anyone knows about?" No, I'd gone pretty hard on his comments about Adam Goodes, and he came right up to me red-faced about 5 o'clock on Derby Day in the Emirates tent and started screaming at me and said, "Do you know how much money? See this? I've got an Order of Australia. I've raised so much. Do you know what I've done for charity and Indigenous people?" I said, "Well, Eddie, the thing is, if you're going to be getting into a pissing contest about the awards system, I think the Australian of the Year probably tops your AM," which he didn't also find particularly amusing. But yeah, look, he's for somebody who says really dumb shit and then constantly half apologises for it, indignantly. It's just like, you know, a slow full toss every time.
Questions? David Poulton, one of this city's finest defamation lawyers, by the way. So he's here as the ultimate safeguard.
Thank you for that intro, Michael. Appreciate it.
It's been weeks since he's written, you know. I was wondering if he was sick or something.
I was going to ask a defamation question, actually, but what I wanted to ask was really about the news of the day, which is what would you guys have done with the filing cabinet?
James?
I think I'd be getting drunk. I would stay drunk for the next 3 weeks and then start publishing. Right?
It is. You can't make this shit up, can you? This filing cabinet found in a ex-government furniture store in Fyshwick.
Because I know there's been started to be a bit of commentary in some of the media about you know, what the ethics are and should the ABC have just packed it all up and sent it back to the you know, Federal Police. And
Absolutely
said, sorry, we
not.
found this really interesting stuff, but we don't want to publish any of it because it would be, you know, really embarrassing to people.
They bought everything fair and square at the down at the second-hand furniture shop. So it was a bit cheeky of ASIO to turn up. So I think a bit of counteraction from Auntie is called for here.
Absolutely.
No, good on them. Whoever found them, I'd like to know what their dry cleaning bill was afterwards, because I would have turned inside out if I'd opened a drawer and found all that stuff.
Spilling out.
Yeah.
Alice, Joe, views on yes or no?
I have to admit, I saw the headline and I actually haven't clicked on the story.
I'm kind of the same way too. I've just come back from 5 weeks in Byron Bay, so James answered for us.
Yeah. No, this filing cabinet full of cabinet documents going all the way back to Howard, I think. So 4 or 5 governments.
Did it include the document about Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey's deliberations in 2014, or...?
No.
No, they somehow leaked another way, did they?
Yes.
Right, oh, okay.
Not that one.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and no, very interesting. So watch this space. I want to ask you as well, Joe, in particular, your column is delightful to read in many respects, but you have a particular skill with coming up with nicknames. There was a guy at the tennis, I think at the Men's Open, who you christened Two Dicks. And you had a grandson or a grandnephew who you christened Octo Dicks, from memory. There's a particular skill in coming up with nicknames, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And frankly, I'd be lying if I didn't say some of my friends and you know, drinking buddies are very helpful at that kind of stuff. You get these ideas from other people. But I have to admit I did come up with Two Dicks myself, and Richards, who's now the CFO of Seven, Seven Group as opposed to Seven West. He was group head of finance at Qantas when I was in corporate affairs at Qantas, so I knew him. And I remember when I was with Lucinda Holdforth, who was at Jeff and Lee and Clifford, and then Alan Joyce's speechwriter, and we were putting together the annual report, and we got this email from a Richard Richards, and I said, Richard Richards, is that like, should we call him Two Dicks, right? But it turns out when he was hired and he went to Seven and I wrote that they've hired Two Dicks, he got really indignant, and I got a call from the great Simon Francis saying, Two Dicks isn't very happy that you've called him Two Dicks. and he'd like you to know that it's a family name, and his father's name was Richard Richards, and his name is Richard Richards, and he's offended, and he doesn't want to see you make fun of him again. All right? Well, what was I going to do then? And then of course someone told me that he's had a son and called him Richard Richards. So the joke being with some friends at Seven that if he's Richard Richards III, and 3 cubed is 8, then I guess that makes him Octo-Dick. But I've since discovered he hasn't got a son, he's only got a daughter, so I don't feel so bad about the young kid. And in some ways I'm hopeful that he could have seen the light now and that he'll call the bloke Bob or something.
Alice, this town's full of footballers with nicknames. Is there one that you've coined or one you particularly like?
I can't think of any nicknames that come to mind, but again, just going back, I like getting a few kind of strange terms, not very Herald Sun friendly terms in there. And talking about Sam Newman, who always makes good fodder. People can't help. I actually wrote about Sam Newman's gazolicas, which was a highlight.
What are gazolicas?
Well, it's anatomy below the belt that I don't have.
Right.
So that was. I actually had to explain to a few people. I also got an eggplant emoji in there once. You're kind of getting my sense of humour. It's sort of schoolboy sense of humour.
I thought gazolicas was a type of cheese.
Well, you never know with Sam Newman.
A bad mistake.
Political nicknames, is there anything that you're particularly proud of or that stands out?
I don't really bother too much with the nicknames themselves because, again, how can you further adorn a name like Erica Betts? It's a beautiful thing. You may as well attach something to a stained glass window. It's as beautiful as it is. But no, I do my adorning in the sentences around the name, so... yeah, look, I'll admit once or twice I may sort of giggle at my own dumb jokes as I write them.
They can be affected, that's the key. You don't want to overuse them.
Yep.
You really want them to be good. And some people's names obviously sometimes people's behaviour lends itself to them. Sometimes their name naturally lends itself to them. Two Dicks being one, the CEO of Myer being another. I mean, having a last name Umbers when you're in financial trouble is lending itself to,
Say it.
No numbers, or has the numbers, doesn't have the numbers. The only other thing it rhymes with is cucumbers, and that's not particularly helpful. But you can see them where it's laboured.
Well, one of the few I bothered with was when Kevin Rudd was a happy backbencher and popping up all over the world. He was in Berlin one week, and he'd be in Washington, and then he'd be in Beijing, and I just wondered how this all pertained to the business of the Brisbane electorate of Griffith, and then decided he must be following some ancient imperial dream of a greater Griffith. And so from there, I made him the holy, spelled with a W, Holy Roman Emperor, R-O-A-M-I apostrophe, and that's one of the few that I've sort of done.
I like that one.
Yeah, and he probably would have loved it too.
Mixed feelings, apparently.
We have a question. Jude Donnelly from the AFL.
Thanks, Michael. My question's for Joe. I'm just here with my guest from Myer. My question's actually about Alex Malley, and I concur, Simon, with your comments before. I followed the stories quite religiously for the last year or so. I'm really curious to know, at any stage did Alex Malley ever make contact with you other than via lawyers to try and sit down, or was there an intermediary on his behalf to say you really should talk to this guy, or was it just such a clear case of, I'm going after this bloke because he's so bad? I'm really curious to know of any kind of personal interactions and if they affected anything that you ended up writing.
No, so I'd met him once on the set of a show that we had. The Fin Review had a show on Channel 9 on Sunday mornings for 2 years, and he sponsored it at the time. But as part of the deal, he had negotiated he had to be on the panel a certain number of weeks. Sounds out of character, of course. And at this point, most of us were going, sorry, who's the sponsor? CPA. What are they? Who are they? What are they? I mean, in some ways you over-exaggerate. I think lots of people know who the CPAs are, but it was hardly Westpac or Coca-Cola or KFC as a retail brand. It was a bit baffling why all of this money was being spent advertising their brand, because it wasn't selling anything. Well, other than Alex, and of course this is the issue. But so we had lunch once. After I met him in person, he asked me to have lunch with him, and it was just fascinating. I was morbidly fascinated by this. I've just never come across an ego like it. It was very hard not to laugh out loud. And I walked away going, God Almighty, that guy is a freak. And then, of course, I started bagging him, more mockery, I would say it started with. But of course, then all of the whistleblowers come out of the woodwork and say you might tease him about spending this much money on sponsoring the tennis, or doing this or doing that. But actually, you should look at this document or that document, or speak to this person. And he got sacked from Macquarie for doing the same thing, and blah. So that became it went from mockery to some pretty serious prosecution fairly quickly, and at that point they issued a big 16-page rebuttal of things I was writing, including a full page of claims that I'd asked him for a job. I was jealous because he was famous and I wasn't, all this kind of stuff, and that we're going to sue, and that we're commencing defamation action. And it was a key decision at that point to back off or to proceed, and we were confident that we had a really good case, as much as any media organisation has a good case anymore when it comes to the courts, who seem to roll out the red carpet for any vexatious applicant. But anyway, I digress. So having accused me in writing of all of these things that didn't happen, there was no contact, no. And I don't know what we could have said to each other, frankly. I mean, that goes to another point. And how do you manage someone when they're coming after you? And I guess there's as many PR people in this room as there are journalists, and we've all been interchangeable and been on different sides of that game. But the interesting thing is, some of my best sources or some of my best kind of professional friendships are actually with people who I've come to know because I went after them. And there's a certain type of person who'll shirt front you at the Emirates tent on Derby Day and scream at you indignantly about how much of a great genius and world leader they are. And there's another kind of person who'll call you up and say, "Ha, you really got me. Why don't I take you out for lunch and tell you some stories?" And I think there are many slow deaths that have occurred on the page because people, through pride or arrogance or wrong-headedness or whatever, have chosen the former rather than the latter.
Can I just say something? I think you make a good point about how the story that maybe started out as a bit tongue-in-cheek and then it developed more, and as you said, whistleblowers come out. I mean, that's often people do kind of trash talk gossip writers or columnists like ourselves, and but it often is the sort of the beginning of a much bigger story that ends up on the front page and ripped out of your column and thrown in there. And often, like when I first started, I used to think, put in that "Have you heard more stamp, what's that going to do? And I remember writing a story about a disgruntled government house employee, and it was, run-of-the-mill story, and then sure enough, do you know more? And whistleblowers, I was, down alleyways getting manila folders with caches of documents, and, it had ended up being three big front-page stories. So often, that's how it starts. And to me, that's really, pure journalism.
Yeah, old school. Alleyways and folders, yes.
It's exciting.
Once in a while, you get the odd bit of dynamite too, just from a reader who just happens to enjoy your work. And one of the ones that I laughed about it for months afterwards, it was a Struth reader who rang up to tell me that up at the airport in Brisbane, somehow 16 items of luggage, 16 belonging to Alan Jones, were accidentally loaded onto Wayne Swan's official plane. But, they're both flying to Melbourne, but Wayne Swan flew off with Alan Jones's luggage. So I thought, well, I'll just float this one to Alan and see what happens. And I had to wait for a couple of days, but let's say Alan knows how to add value, and it was like when he gave me, it was just like just one splendid long controlled blast. So I just sort of put quote marks at the start, quote marks at the end. Got fobbed off by a couple of ministers who pushed from Wayne Swan, pushing me around to defence and whatever, but it was that was a good wheeze.
Yeah.
But seriously, 16 items of luggage.
16.
The man knows how to travel.
We are about to wrap up, so if you've got a question, speak now or forever hold your peace. You mentioned the Emirates tent. I want to ask all of you, how much of the job is wining and dining, going to Machiavelli's or the Flower Drum, Brownlow nights? Is there more of that these days, less than that? How do you balance that in terms of digging up those valuable nuggets of information? Alice?
I find that, if I don't have a lead up my sleeve by about now, then I'll be out, what I call prostituting myself out at events, kind of just hammering tonging and just seeing what's out there. You have to work a room, you have to go out there and kind of put that armour on, as I say, and, everyone's got a story to tell. It's just the right way of asking, but, yeah, the Brownlow days, they're sort of a bit of a thing of the past. But as I said, I was devoid of stories today, for instance, and was worried about what's going to go in the column, and I was just happened to be out there kind of, attacking the phone, and some guy next door started blathering away, and, you can read all about it on Saturday.
Yeah, trust me, it's rolled gold. It's absolute, no, it's, for that other person, wrong place, absolutely wrong time. Joe, and you get around a fair bit, and there are people to find at high-end restaurants and corporate events.
Yeah, it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of if something big and juicy is there, you're going to prefer that in the space over who was having lunch at Mr. Wong or Flower Drum. But it's a nice little filler. I find lunch is the most. I just find it's the best meal to have with people. I used to go out most nights to events, and I just don't go out at all anymore at nights unless it's one of those, the BCA dinner or the midwinter ball, those kind of big events that you really have to go to. It also doesn't help that Fairfax's deadlines have come forward so that you can't actually get anything until the day after, so by which time it can be a bit old. But it's a lot easier if you've got to fill 1,200 words a day, 5 days a week, and you can knock off 200 of them just by keeping an eye on who's in the same room as you. It kind of takes the edge off when you've then got to come up with something a little bit more hard-edged. But, being social is pretty important. That's the relentless part, I find.
And James, no shortage of nosebags on at Parliament House, lots of hospitality there. You see politicians...
Just being in Parliament House usually covers a fair bit. It's like being in a space station anyway, surrounded by a cold, hostile void. So it's such an artificial environment. But yeah, I do venture out, and I'm well acquainted with the dining establishments of Monica and Kingston. Yeah,
where all the good stuff
A lot of
happens.
it's in the, pretty much in the house.
Yep.
Whether in the chamber or a little less formally in the various offices in the corridors, and once in a while stuck in a lift.
And lots of people have said Aussies at the cafe on budget mornings and the like too.
Yeah, there are some people who just permanently camp there. You can't get a seat now for all the lobbyists there.
No, you can't, yeah.